The alarm on my console screamed before the recruit even finished her first lap, and I knew something was wrong with my equipment, because no living body should have been able to keep that pace. My name is Vrex Kalar. I have trained soldiers for the Coalition Defense Corps for 11 cycles. I have broken the will of warriors twice my size and rebuilt them into something the galaxy fears. My own people, the Kethrani, evolved under gravity nearly half again as strong as the standard human world. We are dense, we are heavy-boned, we do not tire, and we do not complain, because complaining wastes air that could be used for breathing during a march. So when Command told me a new species called humans would be joining my next training cohort, I laughed. I had seen the files. Soft skin, slow claws, if you could even call those blunt little things claws. No natural armor, no venom, no extra limbs. Command wanted me to turn these fragile creatures into soldiers capable of standing beside my own people on the front lines, and I intended to show Command exactly how impossible that was on the very first day. That is why I raised the gravity in Training Bay 4 to double standard before the human recruit ever set foot on the deck. Her name was Mara Doyle. She walked in wearing the same gray fatigues as the other recruits, carrying her gear bag over one shoulder like it weighed nothing at all, and she looked around the bay with the calm expression of someone checking into a hotel room, not a military training facility built to break lesser species down to their component parts. I stood at the front of the group, my 4 arms crossed, and I studied her the way a predator studies something it has not decided yet whether to respect or to eat. You will run the perimeter of this bay 20 times, I told the group. My voice box translated my words into their language, flat and mechanical, the way it always did. Anyone who stops before the 20th lap will start again from lap 1. Anyone who falls will be carried out on a medical sled and will not return to this program. The Vantic recruit beside her, a broad reptilian soldier named Dax Coulter, made a low hissing sound that I recognized as nervous laughter. The rest of the cohort shifted their weight, testing the gravity under their boots, feeling the extra pull settle into their joints. I watched their shoulders drop half an inch. I watched their breathing change. Good. That was the point. Mara Doyle rolled her neck once, cracked her knuckles, and got into position at the starting line. I gave the signal, and they ran. By the 5th lap, 3 recruits had dropped to a walk, their chests heaving, sweat soaking through fabric that was never designed for gravity this heavy. By the 10th lap, a Grithari recruit named Ivy Sutton collapsed against the wall, her 4 eyes rolling back, and I sent the medical sled without a second thought, because a body that gives out is a body I cannot use. Mara Doyle was still running. Not sprinting, not straining, running at the same steady pace she had started with, her boots striking the deck in an even rhythm, her breath coming in controlled pulls through her nose. I watched her round the corner of the bay for the 15th time and felt something cold settle behind my ribs, a feeling I had not experienced in a very long time. Doubt. I checked the gravity readout on my wrist console. Double standard. Confirmed. The plating beneath the deck was functioning correctly. I had personally calibrated it that morning. There was no malfunction, no error in the system, nothing to explain why this small, soft, clawless creature was jogging through twice her body weight in gravitational pull, like she was crossing a parking lot back on her home world. By lap 20, only 4 recruits remained standing. Dax Coulter finished on unsteady legs, his tail dragging behind him. A Coalition veteran species recruit named Owen Marsh finished gasping, hands on his knees. And Mara Doyle finished exactly where she started, jogging to a stop, wiping a small amount of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, and then turning to look at me with an expression that was somewhere between polite attention and mild boredom. "Is that the warm-up, sir?" she asked. "Or was that the actual drill?" I did not answer her right away. I could not, because my mind was busy running through every possible explanation, and none of them made sense. I told myself it had to be luck, adrenaline, some strange chemical surge unique to her body that would burn out the moment I pushed harder. Every species has a limit. I had spent my entire career finding those limits and pressing against them until something gave. I decided, standing there on that deck with my doubt curling cold in my chest, that I would find hers. That was the warm-up, I said, and I raised the gravity to triple standard before she had even caught her full breath. The other recruits groaned. Dax Coulter's tail hit the floor with a heavy thud. Owen Marsh actually sat down, right there on the deck, and I let him, because sitting recruits were recruits I could still work with later. Mara Doyle just widened her stance a little, bent her knees slightly, and waited for my next order, like a soldier settling into a more comfortable position, rather than bracing against a crushing new weight. I made her do push-ups next. 50 of them, full range, chest to deck and back up, under triple gravity that made my own dense Kethrani bones ache in sympathy just watching. I expected her arms to buckle around rep 15. I expected her to collapse flat on the deck and stay there, the way every other soft-bodied species I had trained eventually did when I pushed this hard on their first day. She did all 50. Her arms shook slightly near the end, a small tremor I clocked with something close to relief, because it meant she was not made of solid metal underneath that skin. She was still a living creature with limits somewhere. But she finished the set, pushed herself up to standing, and asked if she should start on sit-ups or wait for my order. I stared at her for a long moment. Around us, the other recruits had gone quiet, watching this exchange with wide eyes and the kind of stillness that comes from creatures realizing they are witnessing something they do not understand. Sit-ups, I said finally, because I did not know what else to say, and because some stubborn part of me refused to believe that a single training session could break a pattern I had built my entire career around. Every species has a wall. I had simply not found hers yet. She did the sit-ups. I kept her on that deck for 2 more hours, running her through drills I normally reserved for third-year veterans, all while triple gravity pressed down on her small frame like an invisible hand trying to flatten her into the floor. She slowed down eventually. Her movements became more careful, more deliberate, the kind of controlled effort I recognized from soldiers who were genuinely working hard rather than coasting. But she did not stop. She did not ask to stop. When I finally called an end to the session and dropped the gravity back to standard, the other recruits practically melted with relief, dropping to the deck in exhausted heaps. Mara Doyle stood up straighter, rolled her shoulders like she was shaking off a light jacket, and asked me what time dinner was served. That night, after the recruits had been dismissed to their quarters, I stayed in the training bay long after the lights dimmed to their evening setting. I pulled up the session data on the main console and ran it through every diagnostic I knew, searching for the malfunction that had to be hiding somewhere in the numbers. The gravity plating had functioned perfectly throughout the entire session. The readings were consistent, verified twice by the backup system, cross-checked against 3 independent sensors built into the deck itself. There was no malfunction. The gravity had genuinely been at triple standard for the second half of the session, and a soft, clawless, seemingly fragile human had walked through it like it was an inconvenient afternoon. I sat in the dim light of the empty bay for a long time, turning the data over in my mind, feeling the cold doubt from earlier settle into something closer to fascination. In 11 cycles of training soldiers from a dozen different worlds, I had never encountered a species that did not, eventually, show me their limit. Every recruit, no matter how strong, had a point where their body simply could not go further, and finding that point was the entire foundation of how I built soldiers worth trusting in a fight. Mara Doyle had shown me no such point. Not today. I told myself it meant nothing yet. One session was not a pattern. Perhaps she had simply been running on adrenaline, or some strange human trait that let her ignore pain signals for a short burst before her body caught up with the damage being done to it. Tomorrow, I decided, I would push harder, longer, and I would find the wall that every creature in the galaxy was supposed to have. I did not know yet that I would spend the next several weeks failing to find it, and that the search itself would change how I understood an entire species I had been prepared to dismiss as too fragile for the front lines. I closed the console, dimmed the last of the lights, and walked out of the training bay with a strange, unfamiliar feeling sitting in my chest. It took me until I reached my own quarters to recognize what it was. It was excitement, the kind I had not felt since I was a young recruit myself, standing on a training deck for the first time, wondering what my own limits might turn out to be. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the sound of her boots hitting the deck, steady and unbothered, lap after lap, while gravity itself seemed to lean on her and get nothing back in return. The next morning, I told myself I would be careful, scientific. I would not let excitement cloud my judgment the way it clearly had the day before. So instead of announcing the gravity increase to the entire cohort, I pulled Mara Doyle aside for a solo session and raised the deck plating to triple standard without telling her the number. "Solo drills today," I said. "The rest of the cohort will train separately. I want to see how you perform without a group around you." She shrugged, an oddly casual gesture I was beginning to associate with her more than any other single thing. "Sure thing, sir." I started her on the obstacle course we used for advanced infantry candidates, a brutal sequence of climbing walls, weighted crawls, balance beams suspended over drop pits, and a final sprint through a narrow tunnel filled with resistance jets that pushed against a soldier's body from every direction. Under standard gravity, this course took our best veteran recruits close to 4 minutes to complete, and most of them finished with torn muscles and bruised knuckles for their trouble. I raised the gravity to triple standard the moment she stepped onto the first climbing wall, watching the readout carefully, waiting for the exact second her body would betray the strain her voice never seemed to show. She climbed the wall slower than she had the day before, her fingers gripping harder, her breath coming out in short, controlled bursts through her teeth. Good, I thought. That is what strain looks like. That is the beginning of a limit. She reached the top, swung her legs over, and dropped down onto the weighted crawl section without pausing to catch her breath. The weighted crawl required soldiers to pull themselves along the ground under a low ceiling while dragging a sled loaded with sandbags behind them, sandbags whose actual weight I had also quietly increased that morning while she was still asleep in her quarters. Under triple gravity, that sled now weighed more than she did. I watched the readout on my console tick upward as her heart rate climbed, her muscles working visibly beneath the fabric of her uniform, and I felt a strange mixture of vindication and worry settle in my chest at the same time. She dragged the sled the entire length of the crawl. It took her nearly twice as long as it should have under standard conditions, but she did not stop, did not ask for a break, did not even look toward me for permission to pause. She simply kept pulling, one arm reaching forward, digging into the deck, dragging her body and the sled another few inches, over and over, until she finally emerged from the far end of the crawl section, covered in sweat and breathing hard. I almost called the drill off right there, almost. Some instinct in me, the part that had trained soldiers for over a decade and understood the difference between healthy exhaustion and genuine danger, wanted to end the session before she reached the balance beams. But another part of me, the part that had lain awake the night before turning her impossible endurance over and over in my mind, wanted to know exactly where the wall was. I let her continue. The balance beams stretched over a drop pit filled with soft padding designed to prevent injury during a fall, but the psychological pressure of crossing a narrow beam under heavy gravity was often enough to break a recruit's concentration entirely. I had seen soldiers twice Mara Doyle's size freeze completely on that beam, their legs locking up, their balance abandoning them the moment the extra weight settled into their inner ear and threw off every instinct they had ever trusted. She crossed it without a single wobble. I stared at the readout, then at her small figure balanced perfectly on a beam no wider than her own boot, moving with the same steady, deliberate pace she had shown on her very first lap around the training bay the day before. She reached the far platform, stepped down, and turned to look at me across the bay. "Is something wrong with the gravity plating, sir?" she called out. "Feels a bit heavier than yesterday." My whole body went still. She had noticed. Finally, some acknowledgement that the crushing weight I had loaded onto her was not simply invisible to her senses. "Why do you ask?" I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. She rolled her shoulder, wincing slightly. My knee's a little sore from the wall climb. Probably just slept on it wrong. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling something between disbelief and a strange, reluctant admiration settle over me. She had not noticed the gravity at all. She had noticed a minor ache in her knee and attributed it to sleeping in an odd position, completely unaware that she was currently moving through a gravitational field 3 times stronger than what her body had evolved under. I sent her through the resistance tunnel anyway, because I had come too far in this experiment to stop before I understood it fully. The jets inside the tunnel were designed to simulate combat conditions, blasts of pressurized air that struck a soldier's body from random directions, forcing them to adjust their footing constantly while sprinting forward. Under triple gravity, each blast would hit with roughly 3 times the force a recruit's body was used to compensating for. She staggered twice. I watched her stumble sideways after the second jet caught her from the left, her boots sliding slightly on the deck plating, and for one heart-stopping moment I genuinely thought I was about to watch her fall. But she caught herself, planted her foot hard, and kept moving forward through the tunnel, emerging on the other side with her uniform soaked through and her breathing ragged, but her legs still carrying her weight without collapsing. I ended the solo session there, dropping the gravity back to standard before I told her the drill was complete. She sat down on a nearby bench, drank an entire bottle of water in what looked like a single continuous swallow, and asked me, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than complaint, whether all coalition training was going to be this intense, or if today had just been an especially hard day. I told her that training intensity varied, which was technically true, and also carefully avoided answering the question she was actually asking. She nodded, accepted the answer without pushing further, and went to shower before the evening meal, leaving me alone in the bay once again with data I did not fully understand and a growing obsession I could not quite explain to myself. That evening, I went to see the base's chief engineer, a coalition veteran named Corin Blake, who had spent decades studying the physiology of every species that came through this facility. I found her in her workshop, surrounded by diagnostic equipment and half-disassembled gravity plating, and I told her everything: the numbers, the readouts, the way Mara Doyle had crossed a balance beam under triple gravity without a single misstep, while worrying only about a sore knee. Corin listened to the entire account without interrupting, her expression shifting from polite professional interest to something sharper, more focused, as I described each escalating detail. "You said her heart rate climbed during the drills," she said finally. "That tells us her body is registering the increased load. She is not immune to the gravity. She is simply not registering it the way most species would." "Explain the difference," I said. Corin pulled up a set of files on her console, old records from Earth's own history that the Coalition had collected when human recruits first entered the wider galactic community. Human bodies evolved under a relatively narrow range of gravitational conditions, similar to most species we have on file. But their nervous systems developed something unusual: a very high pain tolerance threshold, combined with a psychological tendency to normalize discomfort rather than flag it as dangerous. Their species spent much of its history pushing physical limits voluntarily, for reasons that had nothing to do with survival, competition, recreation, simple stubbornness. Their bodies learned to treat sustained physical stress as an expected condition rather than an emergency signal. I turned this over in my mind, thinking of the way Mara Doyle had blamed a sore knee on poor sleep rather than 3 times standard gravity. So her body knows something is different. It simply does not tell her mind to worry about it. "Precisely," Corin said. "Which means you could very seriously injure her before her own instincts warn her to stop. Her tolerance is a strength, Vrex, but it is also a significant risk if you continue pushing without proper safeguards." I heard the warning in her voice clearly enough, and some part of me knew she was right. But I also felt, sitting there in that workshop with the data glowing on the console between us, a pull towards something I could not quite name, not simply curiosity anymore, something closer to purpose. If humans truly carried this hidden tolerance inside them, tolerance that even they themselves did not fully understand, then finding its true edge was no longer just a personal obsession. It was information the entire coalition needed, because a species capable of enduring this much without breaking, without even registering the strain as dangerous, was a species capable of standing on the front lines in ways no one back home had yet imagined. "I want to keep testing her," I told Corin, "carefully, with your monitoring equipment in place, so we catch any genuine danger before it becomes serious." Corin studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she finally nodded. "I will build you a monitoring rig, full vital tracking, real-time alerts if her body shows genuine signs of failure rather than simple fatigue. But Vrex, listen to me carefully. The moment those alerts trigger, you stop, immediately. No exceptions, no matter how curious you have become." I agreed, and I meant it at the time. I did not yet know how difficult that promise would become to keep, or how quickly my careful, scientific curiosity would turn into something closer to a competition I could not walk away from. Over the following days, I began integrating the increased gravity into what I called standard training, adjusting the plating gradually enough that no single session looked dramatically different from the one before it. I told myself this was simply efficient testing, a controlled variable increased slowly enough to gather clean data. In truth, I think some part of me had already decided I did not want her to notice, because the not noticing had become the most fascinating part of the entire experiment. She continued to perform every drill I gave her. She continued to outlift, outrun, and outlast recruits from species built specifically for heavy combat conditions, all while complaining, when she complained at all, about things that had nothing to do with gravity. The cafeteria food was too bland. Her boots were breaking in slower than she expected. She missed something called rain, a kind of weather her homeworld apparently produced regularly, which she described to a bewildered Dax Coulter one evening as water falling from the sky, for no particular reason at all. I watched her from across the mess hall during that conversation, listening to her laugh at Dax Coulter's confused questions about why anyone would want water falling on them uninvited, and I felt that same strange excitement from my first sleepless night returning, stronger now, harder to ignore. I was no longer simply testing a hypothesis. I had begun, without fully admitting it to myself, to root for her, to want to see just how far this quiet, complaining, endlessly capable creature could go before the galaxy itself gave her a reason to notice. I did not know yet that word of my private experiment had already begun spreading among the other drill instructors on base, or that within a matter of days my careful scientific curiosity would become something else entirely. A contest, a bet, a race among a dozen instructors to see who could push a human recruit the furthest before she finally looked up from her drills and asked why everything suddenly felt so heavy. It started with a message left on my console, short and unsigned, though I recognized the blunt phrasing immediately as belonging to instructor Garrick Voss, a Kethrani veteran who had trained alongside me for 6 cycles and never once let an opportunity for rivalry pass him by uncommented. The message read simply, "Heard your human broke the crawl course record without noticing the sled weight. Bring her to Bay 7 tomorrow. Let us see what she does with real resistance." I stared at that message for longer than I would like to admit before I finally understood what had happened. Corin Blake, for all her careful warnings about safety and monitoring equipment, had apparently mentioned the details of my experiment to at least one other engineer on base, and from there, the story had traveled the way stories always traveled among a group of competitive, battle-hardened instructors with nothing better to do during their off hours than compare training methods and argue about which of us produced the toughest soldiers. By the time I walked into the instructor's common room that evening, 4 other drill sergeants were already waiting for me, along with 2 engineers I recognized from the maintenance division and a datapad covered in numbers that I quickly realized was a running tally. "There she is," Garrick said, his 4 eyes glinting with something between amusement and genuine interest. "The instructor with the human who does not know how to quit." I felt an immediate defensive urge rise in my chest, though I could not entirely explain why. Perhaps because their tone made this sound like a joke, a curiosity to laugh over, rather than the significant discovery I had come to believe it truly was. "She has a name," I said. "Mara Doyle. And this is not a game, Garrick. Her tolerance level could tell us something important about how humans might perform in actual combat conditions." Garrick raised both sets of hands in mock surrender. Of course. Very important, very scientific. Which is why Instructor Palak here already has 50 credits on the table saying she breaks before 3.5 gravity, and Instructor Faya has 75 saying she makes it past quadruple before her body finally shows real strain. I looked around the room at the assembled instructors, each of them watching me with expressions ranging from genuine scientific curiosity to the kind of competitive hunger I recognized from my own reflection in the mirror lately, and I felt something shift inside me. I told myself I was angry at the reduction of something important into a simple wager. I told myself I wanted to protect Mara Doyle from becoming a spectacle for other instructors to gamble over. But if I am being honest, sitting here now with the full weight of everything that followed, I think what I actually felt in that moment was excitement. The same pull that had kept me awake that first night. The same fascination that had sent me to Corin Blake's workshop instead of simply filing a routine report and moving on with my duties. A part of me wanted to know the answer just as badly as they did, and having other instructors invested in the outcome only made the entire pursuit feel more urgent, more important, more worth the risk. "Fine," I said, before I had fully decided to say it, "but it happens under my supervision, with Corin's monitoring equipment in place, and the moment her vitals show genuine danger, the test stops. No exceptions. Anyone who tries to push past that line without my permission answers to me directly." The room went quiet for a moment at the sharpness in my voice, and then Garrick nodded slowly, a gesture of genuine respect rather than mockery. "Understood. Your recruit, your rules. But you cannot deny us the chance to watch, Vrex. This is the most interesting thing to happen on this base in cycles." I could not deny it, because he was right, and because some part of me wanted the audience nearly as much as the other instructors did. Over the following 2 weeks, what had begun as my private, careful experiment became a shared obsession among nearly every instructor on base. We built an informal schedule, rotating who supervised Mara Doyle's drills each day, always under the pretense of standard rotational training that every recruit received as part of their program, always with the gravity plating quietly adjusted upward by small, careful increments that Corin Blake monitored and logged with growing concern etched permanently into her expression. Mara Doyle, for her part, continued through every session with the same steady, unbothered focus she had shown from the very first day. She ran longer distances. She lifted heavier loads. She crossed obstacle courses that had been specifically redesigned by Instructor Faya to punish recruits who could not maintain perfect balance under stress, and she crossed them without a single fall, though her recovery time between drills grew noticeably longer as the days passed. A detail that Corin flagged repeatedly in her reports, and that I noted with a mixture of concern and, I am ashamed to admit, satisfaction, because it meant the gravity was finally, genuinely affecting her, even if her own awareness of that fact remained stubbornly, almost comically absent. "The cafeteria really needs to fix the portion sizes," she told me one evening, sitting on the same bench where she always rested after a session, wiping sweat from her face with a towel, while her hands trembled slightly from exertion she did not seem to register as unusual. "I have been starving after training lately. Feels like I am burning twice the calories I used to." I stood there, watching her drink water with hands that were visibly shaking from muscles pushed to their genuine physical limit under nearly quadruple standard gravity, and I told her I would speak to the kitchen staff about increasing her portions. I did not tell her the truth. I did not tell any of them the truth for much longer than I should have, and looking back now, I recognize that as the moment my careful scientific curiosity had fully curdled into something closer to reckless obsession, the kind that convinces a person they are still in control of a situation long after that control has quietly slipped away. The other instructors began bringing their own recruits to watch her sessions, using the excuse of demonstrating proper form and discipline to a soldier who never seemed to complain, though I suspect most of them simply wanted their recruits to witness something they themselves still struggled to believe. Dax Coulter, the Vantic recruit who had run beside her on that very first day, began treating her with a kind of quiet, reverent awe that clearly embarrassed her, though she never told him to stop. "You are not even breathing hard," he said to her one afternoon, after she completed a full circuit of the obstacle course that had left him coughing and doubled over against the nearest wall. "How do you do that?" She shrugged, that same casual gesture I had come to know so well by then. "I do not know. I guess I am just built for this." I stood nearby, listening to that exchange, and felt the cold doubt from my very first night with her return in full force, stronger now, tangled up with something that felt uncomfortably close to guilt. She thought this was simply who she was. She had no idea that the world around her had been quietly, deliberately reshaped to test the outer edges of what her body could endure. And every day I let that misunderstanding continue, I moved further from the careful, responsible instructor I had believed myself to be when this had all started. Instructor Faya approached me near the end of the second week with an idea that, in hindsight, should have been the moment I finally called the entire experiment to an end. She wanted to combine 3 separate training modules into a single continuous session, gravity increased to just under quintuple standard, designed specifically to simulate the exhaustion of an extended combat engagement without any rest periods between phases. It was, by every professional standard I had upheld throughout my career, an excessive and irresponsible request. I agreed to it anyway. Corin Blake refused outright when I brought the plan to her workshop, standing firm despite the pressure from nearly every other instructor on base who had gathered by then to watch the results unfold. "This is no longer testing, Vrex," she said, her voice sharp with a frustration I had never heard from her before. "This is spectacle. You are treating a living recruit like an experiment designed for entertainment, and I will not authorize monitoring equipment for a session I believe crosses well beyond reasonable safety thresholds." I told her I would proceed with or without her monitoring equipment, a decision I regret more than almost any other I have made in my career, because it meant the one safeguard capable of stopping this before real harm occurred was no longer in place when the session finally began. The morning of the combined session, Mara Doyle arrived at the training bay the same way she always did, gear bag over one shoulder, expression calm and unbothered, completely unaware that nearly every instructor on base had gathered along the observation deck above to watch what we had planned for her. I looked up at that crowd, at Garrick and Faya and Palak and a dozen others I recognized from years of shared service, and felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach that I chose, in that moment, to ignore. "Big audience today," she said, glancing up at the observation deck with mild curiosity. "Special occasion?" "Just a thorough evaluation," I told her, and I raised the gravity to just under quintuple standard before she had finished stretching, watching the readout climb on my console, while the crowd above leaned forward in collective, breathless anticipation. She started the first module, a distance run around the perimeter of the bay, and I watched her pace slow gradually over the following minutes, watched sweat soak through her uniform faster than I had ever seen before, watched her breathing turn ragged in a way that finally looked like genuine struggle rather than simple exertion. Around me, I heard low murmurs from the observation deck, instructors exchanging credits, adjusting their wagers as the numbers climbed higher than any of us had truly believed she would reach. By the second module, the weighted crawl, her arms were shaking visibly with every pull forward, her face flushed and strained in a way I had never witnessed from her before, and something in my chest twisted painfully at the sight, a feeling I recognized, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, as fear. Not fear of failure, fear for her. I told myself I would end it after this module. I told myself one more phase would give us the clean data we needed to finally understand her limits, and then I would call the session complete and let her rest. I did not stop it after the second module. I let her begin the third. She was 3 steps into the balance beam crossing, her legs trembling beneath nearly 5 times the gravity her body had ever known, when her foot finally, for the very first time since I had known her, missed its mark entirely. I moved before I had time to think, 4 legs carrying me across the training bay faster than I had run in cycles, my heart pounding against my ribs with a force that had nothing to do with gravity and everything to do with pure animal fear. She caught herself on the edge of the beam with one hand, her body swinging dangerously over the padded pit below, and for one endless second I genuinely believed I was about to watch her fall and I would have no one to blame but myself. She did not fall. Her fingers gripped the edge of the beam, her knuckles white with effort, and with a grunt that sounded more frustrated than pained, she pulled herself back up onto the beam and stood there, chest heaving, legs trembling visibly beneath her. "Sorry," she said, breathless, looking down at her feet like she could not quite understand why they had betrayed her. "Lost my footing there for a second. Guess I am more tired than I thought." I did not respond. I could not, because my voice had abandoned me entirely, and because in that single suspended moment, watching her sway slightly on the beam, I understood with complete and total clarity exactly how close I had come to seriously hurting her, all in pursuit of a curiosity that had long since stopped being about legitimate scientific discovery and had become, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, about my own ego and the approval of instructors watching from a deck above who had no real stake in her well-being at all. "Session's over," I said, my voice cracking slightly on the words. "Get down from there, now." She looked at me with surprise, clearly confused by the sudden shift in my tone, but she climbed down carefully, her legs still trembling, and I lowered the gravity back to standard the moment her boots touched the deck. I watched relief wash visibly through her body as the crushing weight lifted, her shoulders dropping, her breathing beginning to slow, though she still looked more confused than anything else, glancing between me and the silent crowd above on the observation deck. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. Before I could answer her, the doors at the far end of the training bay slid open, and Colonel Grace Bennett walked in, flanked by 2 members of Coalition Command's Inspection Division, her expression already carrying the particular kind of controlled fury that I recognized from every disciplinary hearing I had ever witnessed on this base. "Instructor Vrex Kalar," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent bay, "you will explain to me right now why the gravity plating in this facility is registering readings that exceed every safety threshold this base has ever authorized, and you will explain why an entire crowd of instructors is standing on that observation deck watching a single recruit like it is some kind of entertainment event." I felt every instructor on the deck above shift uncomfortably at her words, several of them already retreating quietly toward the exits, and I understood in that moment that whatever explanation I gave would need to account for choices that were entirely, completely my own to answer for. "Colonel," I began, and then stopped, because I genuinely did not know how to explain the last 2 weeks, in a way that did not sound exactly as reckless and irresponsible as it truly had become. I was conducting an evaluation of human physical tolerance under increased gravitational conditions. The readings were within acceptable limits until this morning's session. "Within acceptable limits," Colonel Bennett repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. "Instructor, the readout on this deck currently shows gravity at nearly 5 times standard. That is not an evaluation. That is negligence, and if this recruit had suffered a serious injury during that fall I just watched from the corridor camera feed, you would be facing far more than a disciplinary review." Mara Doyle, standing beside me with her towel still clutched in one hand, looked between the colonel and me with an expression that had shifted from confusion into something closer to genuine shock. "5 times standard?" she said slowly. "Sir, is that what the gravity has actually been the whole time?" I could not meet her eyes. "Not the whole time," I admitted. "It began at double standard on your first day. It has been increased gradually since then." She was quiet for a long moment, and I watched her work through the implications of what I had just told her, watched her expression cycle through disbelief, then something that looked almost like betrayal, before finally settling into an expression I had not expected at all. Curiosity. "I genuinely had no idea," she said, more to herself than to either of us. "I just thought I was having some really rough weeks. I blamed it on bad sleep. I blamed it on the food here being different from what I am used to. I never once thought it was the actual gravity." Colonel Bennett's expression shifted slightly at this, her sharp focus moving from me to Mara Doyle, with obvious professional interest overtaking some of her anger, though the anger clearly had not disappeared entirely. "You are telling me you experienced no conscious awareness that the gravitational conditions had changed at all, across a full 2-week escalation from double standard to nearly quintuple standard?" "No, ma'am," Mara Doyle said, straightening slightly despite her obvious exhaustion. I noticed I was more tired than usual, sore in places I did not expect, but I just figured that was normal for military training. Nobody told me it was supposed to feel easy." I watched Colonel Bennett's expression shift again, this time into something I recognized as the same fascination that had kept me awake that very first night, and despite the serious trouble I clearly remained in, I felt a small, strange flicker of vindication at watching someone else finally witness what I had been struggling to explain for 2 weeks. The colonel ordered the training bay cleared immediately, sending the remaining instructors on the observation deck back to their quarters, with a promise that each of them would be answering questions of their own before this was over, and she instructed Corin Blake, who had arrived moments earlier looking pale and furious, to conduct a full medical evaluation of Mara Doyle before anyone left the bay. The evaluation took nearly 2 hours. I waited outside the medical bay the entire time, pacing the corridor with a knot of guilt sitting heavy in my chest, running through every decision I had made over the past 2 weeks, and finding almost none of them defensible when I looked at them honestly. I had let curiosity become obsession. I had let the approval and excitement of other instructors push me past boundaries I had sworn to Corin Blake I would respect. I had, in the end, treated a recruit who trusted me to train her properly as something closer to a subject in an experiment she never consented to and never even fully understood was happening. When Corin finally emerged from the medical bay, her expression was tired, but not alarmed, and something in my chest loosened slightly at the sight. "She is fine," Corin said, "exhausted, significantly more fatigued than any reading I have on file for a human recruit, with some muscle strain in her right shoulder from the fall on the beam. But no serious injury. Her body, remarkably, appears to have handled the sustained load without any of the structural damage I would expect to see in almost any other species pushed this far this fast." Relief hit me so hard I had to lean against the corridor wall for a moment to steady myself. "Can I speak with her?" Corin studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "She asked to speak with you as well. But Vrex, listen to me. Whatever happens next with command, you owe her the complete truth. All of it. She deserves to understand exactly what has been done to her body over these past 2 weeks, and she deserves to decide for herself how she feels about it, without you softening any part of the story to protect yourself." I found Mara Doyle sitting on the edge of a medical cot, her shoulder wrapped in a support brace, looking remarkably composed for someone who had just learned her entire training experience over the past 2 weeks had been secretly escalated far beyond anything any other recruit on base had endured. She looked up when I entered, and I braced myself for anger, for the kind of betrayal I fully believed I deserved to face. Instead, she asked me a single question. Was I actually doing well, or was this whole thing just you trying to see how much you could get away with before I broke? I told her the truth, every part of it, exactly as Corin had instructed me to. I told her about that first day, about the doubt that had settled behind my ribs when she finished 20 laps without breaking pace. I told her about the solo sessions, about Corin's warnings, about the bet that had formed among the other instructors, and how I had let their excitement feed my own, until I lost track of where careful curiosity ended and reckless obsession began. I told her about the fear I had felt watching her stumble on that beam, a fear more intense than anything I had experienced in over a decade of training soldiers for the front lines. She listened to all of it without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and when I finally finished, the training bay fell silent except for the quiet hum of the medical equipment monitoring her recovering body. "You should have told me," she said finally, and her voice carried real hurt beneath the calm delivery, hurt I fully deserved to hear, not because I could not have handled it, but because it was my body and my choice to make about how far I was willing to push it. "You are right," I said, and I meant it completely. "I have no excuse that makes what I did acceptable. I let my own curiosity, and eventually my own pride, matter more than your trust in me as your instructor. I am sorry, Mara, genuinely." She studied me for a long moment, and then, to my complete surprise, something that might have been the beginning of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "So," she said slowly, "when you say nearly 5 times standard gravity, that is actually kind of impressive, right? Like in a scientific sense." I stared at her, caught completely off guard by the question, and felt a strange, unexpected laugh escape me despite everything. "Yes," I admitted, "it is unprecedented. No species on record has tolerated sustained exposure at that level without significant injury." She nodded slowly, processing this, and then leaned back against the medical cot with an expression that had shifted from hurt into something more thoughtful. "Okay," she said, "I am still mad at you. That is not going away for a while. But I also kind of want to know what my actual limit is now, properly this time, with me knowing what is happening, and with actual safety rules, and with you asking me first instead of deciding for me." I did not know what to say to that, standing there in the quiet medical bay with guilt and something close to hope tangled together in my chest, uncertain whether the conversation ahead of us with Colonel Bennett and the full weight of Coalition Command's disciplinary process would even allow either of us the chance to find out. The disciplinary hearing took place 3 days later, in a chamber I had only ever entered twice before in my entire career, both times to witness other instructors answer for far less serious mistakes than the one I now had to account for. Colonel Bennett sat at the center of a long table, flanked by 2 senior coalition officers I did not recognize, and behind them, on a secondary screen, sat a representative from the Xenobiology Division whose presence told me immediately that this hearing had grown into something far larger than a simple disciplinary matter concerning one reckless instructor. I stood at the center of the chamber and gave my full account, exactly as I had given it to Mara Doyle 3 days earlier, leaving out no detail, softening no part of my own responsibility. I told them about the doubt, the fascination, the bet, the pressure from other instructors, and the moment on that balance beam when fear had finally cut through everything else and shown me exactly how far I had let this go. When I finished, the chamber remained silent for a long moment, and I genuinely believed I was about to hear the end of my career as a drill instructor. Instead, the representative from the Xenobiology Division leaned forward toward her screen, her expression sharp with an interest that seemed to override whatever disciplinary concerns the rest of the panel carried. "Instructor Kalar," she said, "I want to be completely clear that your methods were reckless, unauthorized, and placed a recruit under your direct care at genuine risk of serious harm. That will be reflected fully in your disciplinary record, and Colonel Bennett will determine the appropriate consequences for that recklessness." I nodded, accepting this without argument, because I knew every word of it was fair. "However," she continued, "the data you gathered, however irresponsibly, represents the single most significant finding about human physiology that the Coalition has recorded since our first contact with their species. No human recruit has ever been tested under these conditions with proper monitoring equipment in place, largely because no instructor believed it was worth attempting given how fragile human physiology appears on the surface. You have inadvertently proven that assumption catastrophically wrong." Colonel Bennett's expression remained stern, but I noticed something shift slightly in her posture, a grudging acknowledgement that the situation in front of her had become more complicated than a simple case of instructor misconduct. "The recruit herself has submitted a formal statement," she said, glancing down at a datapad in front of her. "She has confirmed that while she was not informed of the gravity increases and considers that a serious breach of trust that should be addressed through proper disciplinary channels, she has also formally requested to continue participating in further testing, provided it is conducted with full transparency, proper safety protocols, and her explicit informed consent going forward." I felt something loosen in my chest at those words, a relief so sharp it nearly buckled my knees, though I kept my posture rigid and professional in front of the panel. Mara Doyle had not simply forgiven the situation and walked away. She had chosen, with full knowledge of everything that had happened, to continue forward into whatever came next, on her own terms this time. The panel deliberated for the better part of an hour while I waited outside the chamber, and when Colonel Bennett finally called me back in, her verdict came swiftly and without much room for negotiation. I would be formally reprimanded, my authority to conduct solo training sessions suspended for a full training cycle, and every future evaluation involving Mara Doyle or any human recruit going forward would require joint oversight from both a training instructor and a member of the Xenobiology Division, with mandatory informed consent documentation before any gravitational adjustment could be implemented. It was a fair consequence, lighter than I had expected given the severity of what I had done, and I suspected, though nobody said it directly, that the unprecedented value of the data itself had played some quiet role in tempering the panel's judgment. What happened next unfolded far faster than I expected. Within a single cycle, the Xenobiology Division had launched a full, properly authorized research program built directly on the foundation of what my reckless 2 weeks of unauthorized testing had accidentally uncovered. Mara Doyle became its first official subject, though I noticed quickly that the term subject fell out of use almost immediately, replaced instead by something closer to partner, a shift in language that seemed to matter greatly to her and that I made certain, in every session going forward, to honor completely. The new testing protocol looked nothing like my original reckless experiment. Every session began with a full briefing, the exact gravity level stated clearly before the drill commenced, her explicit verbal consent recorded before Corin Blake, now serving as lead medical monitor for the entire program, would authorize the plating adjustment. Mara Doyle reviewed every proposed increase herself, sometimes pushing for a higher threshold than even I would have suggested, sometimes requesting we hold steady for an extra session before advancing further, and I found, working alongside her under these new transparent conditions, that the fascination I had felt from the very beginning had not diminished at all. If anything, watching her make informed, deliberate choices about her own limits made the entire process feel more remarkable than it ever had when I was simply pushing her without her knowledge. We reached quintuple standard gravity within the first month of the official program, a threshold she crossed with full awareness this time, her jaw set with determination rather than casual unconcern, sweat soaking through her uniform as she completed a full obstacle course circuit while Corin monitored her vitals from a station beside the deck, ready to halt the session the instant any reading crossed into genuine danger. She finished that circuit, sat down hard on the nearest bench, and looked up at me with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and fierce pride. "Okay," she said, breathing hard. "That one I actually noticed." I could not help the laugh that escaped me, a real one, free of the guilt that had colored nearly every interaction between us since the hearing. "Progress," I said. "Do not get used to it," she shot back, though the corner of her mouth had curved into something close to a genuine smile. "I am still going to outlast whatever number you people eventually decide is my actual limit." Word of the program spread quickly through the wider coalition, and within 2 cycles, similar testing protocols had been authorized for human recruits at 3 other training facilities across coalition space, each one building carefully on the data our program continued to generate. Other species began requesting their own comparative studies, curious whether their own physiology carried hidden tolerances that traditional training methods had simply never thought to test for, and the entire field of coalition physical evaluation began shifting in ways that would take years to fully understand. Dax Coulter, who had watched the earliest days of Mara Doyle's training with a mixture of confusion and awe, eventually asked to be included in a comparative study of his own species' tolerance levels, and I found myself, alongside Corin Blake and a small team from the Xenobiology Division, developing an entirely new evaluation framework that would eventually be adopted across every training facility in Coalition space. It became, somewhat to my own disbelief, the defining professional achievement of my career, born entirely from a mistake I had nearly let cost a recruit her safety and my own integrity as an instructor. 6 months after that disciplinary hearing, Mara Doyle graduated from the training program with a physical evaluation score that Coalition Command formally classified as an outlier requiring its own separate baseline, distinct from every other species on record. I stood among the instructors gathered to watch the graduation ceremony, Garrick beside me, Faya on my other side, both of them considerably more subdued these days after their own disciplinary reviews concerning the bet that had spiraled so far out of control, and I watched Mara Doyle receive her graduation marker with the same steady, unbothered expression she had worn on her very first day walking into my training bay. Afterward, she found me near the edge of the ceremony hall, already dressed in the field uniform that marked her transition from recruit to active Coalition soldier. "So," she said, "I heard a rumor you are already drafting proposals for a follow-up program. Something about testing tolerance thresholds under combined gravity and combat stress conditions." "The proposal is still in early stages," I admitted. "It would require volunteers willing to undergo significantly more demanding evaluation than anything we have attempted so far." She crossed her arms, studying me with an expression I had come to recognize well over the past several months, equal parts challenge and genuine curiosity. "Put my name on the list," she said, "but this time you ask me first, you tell me the actual numbers, and if I ever ask you to stop, you stop immediately. No exceptions." Those terms were always going to be non-negotiable, I told her, and I meant it completely, the words carrying none of the reckless curiosity that had defined our very first weeks together, and all of the hard-earned respect that had grown in its place instead. She nodded, satisfied, and turned to leave the ceremony hall alongside Dax Coulter and Owen Marsh, both of whom had also graduated that day, though neither had come anywhere close to the outlier classification that now followed Mara Doyle's name through every official Coalition record. I stayed behind in the empty ceremony hall for a while after the others had gone, thinking back to that very first morning, the cold doubt that had settled behind my ribs when a soft, clawless creature I had been fully prepared to dismiss finished 20 laps under gravity meant to break her, without so much as a change in her breathing pattern. I thought about every mistake I had made, chasing the answer to a question that had, in the end, mattered far more than my own pride ever should have been allowed to. Somewhere out on a training deck I could not see from where I stood, I imagined the next gravity readout climbing steadily upward, properly authorized this time, properly explained, properly consented to, and I found myself already wondering, with the same restless curiosity that had never truly left me, what number it would finally take before Mara Doyle looked up from her drills and told me, without a single hint of surprise in her voice, that she had genuinely, finally noticed. I suspected, standing there alone in that quiet hall, that the number did not exist yet, and some part of me, the part that had spent an entire career believing every creature in the galaxy carried a limit, waiting to be found, had already begun to hope that it never would.